But for now, it's 4 o'clock. We're going to get going. Hello, everybody. I'm Michelle Hebert, Director of Communications here at SAANYS, and welcome to today's very popular session, Managing Special Education When You Don't Have a Special Education Background. We do have a sponsor for today's event. It's Lego Education. So if you could just hold on 1 minute and we'll share some words from our sponsor and then we'll get going.
More than 2 years, because the last director before you to visit with somebody new.
Okay, class, how about we try something new in science today? So we've been talking about biodiversity, right? How can the base of these wind turbines help marine species to thrive?
We could build a park for the fish. Oh, we could build an artificial reef on the base too.
Lego Education brings the power of hands-on learning into classrooms everywhere so that any subject clicks for every student. The future is in their hands.
Okay, everyone, give me 1 second. Okay. All right, well, thank you, Lego, as always. They're a great sponsor to SAANYS and a good friend. So again, I just want to remind everybody that we are recording today's session. And if you could stay in mute mode till we get to some Q&A. I think we're all set to begin. So I'll begin by introducing our Director of Professional Learning, Karen Bronson. Karen?
Thanks so much, Michelle. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We're really excited to get started. This is really just, it's been a wonderful experience already.
We're going to sit down,
working with our panel and planning with them. At this point, we're going to ask everyone to please make sure you are muted.
This is the direction we would.
Let's see. Everyone, please just double check that you're muted. Thanks so much. I'm going to give you a couple of housekeeping things, and I do want to just kind of talk about the goal of today's panel and good things that we hope will follow. So first of all, as we said, please stay on mute unless and when you would like to unmute for questions and comments, which we would love for you to do. But otherwise, please stay on mute, and we would also love it if you would leave your cameras on. We would really like to see your face. We have a big group today, and I just think that, you know, the more we kind of get to know each other here on the better. So keep your camera on if you would like to. Please use the chat as well. I want to tell you a couple of things. As Michelle said, this session is being recorded, and the recording and a list of resources from our panelists will be sent to everyone who registered after the event. That may take a day or two. It might even be early next week, but you will get a copy of this recorded meeting, and our panelists have been great about contributing resources that kind of connect with different topics and areas that we've covered. So you will get that as well. I do want to take a moment, as I said before I introduce our panel, just to tell you about kind of the purpose of our first, what we hope is first of many and more meetings around this topic of support for folks who lead special ed, who may or may not have special education backgrounds themselves. Our purpose today is not to answer all the questions and hit all the bases and just clear up all of the issues that are out there and questions, because that would be impossible in this short hour. But we are going to start the conversation today. That is our goal, to start the conversation around support related to special education leadership, particularly if you may not have a special ed background. So this conversation today is a springboard for things that will follow. You can expect, and we promise, to provide more events around this topic, including a panel at our upcoming conference, including, please make sure you're muted, including a conference at our panel, including a cohort series throughout the next school year on this topic. And I feel like I have really met the A team here, and I mean that sincerely. We have the best of the best in terms of expertise and every kind of knowledge and skill to share. So I hope to use this wonderful A team of super friends, as I've started to call the group, And hopefully you'll see them again at our conference and after that. So today's just a start. If you sent in questions, we received your questions. We clustered them together and we hope to hit on some common themes today as much as we are able in this first short format, but we will get to them in our other formats. Okay, so we would like to just kind of do some quick introductions now, and then we'll kind of dive right in. I am so happy to welcome our panelists today. We have Joyce Carr, and maybe you can just kind of wave if there's Joyce. Joyce was a past president of SAANYS, and she has 34 plus years in special education as a teacher and administrator in public schools in New York State. Joyce is also the founder of Inclusion Schools, assisting districts and organizations with special education development. And as I said, she's one of our former presidents. So welcome, Joyce. Joyce has presented at our conferences and introduced me to Lauren Hough Williams. Lauren, welcome today. Lauren is the executive director of NYU's Program for Inclusion and Neurodiversity Education. That's called the PINE program, P-I-N-E. And at the end of our program today, Lauren will tell you about a PINE event that you will have some access to that you may not want to miss. So thank you for being here today, Lauren. I'm so happy to introduce Andrew Ecker. Good afternoon, Andrew. Andrew is from my old stomping ground, the Lower Hudson Regional Partnership Center at Putnam Northern Westchester BOCES. And he is co-president of the New York Council of Administrators of Special Education, NYCASE, N-Y-C-A-S-E. NYCASE is well represented today, as you will see. So Andrew, welcome, and welcome from NYCASE. Brett French is here with us. Brett, my neighbor across the hall at SAANYS. Brett is one of our attorneys at SAANYS, and Brett is very, very closely involved with issues around special ed and has been such a great support to us on this panel, just kind of bringing us the kinds of things that he and our other attorneys deal with on a day-to-day basis. So Brett, so happy to have you here today. We are delighted to have Joanne Lane with us. Good afternoon, Joanne. I met Joanne at our conference last year. She is a SAANYS member. She has 40 plus years, as everyone on our panel, that's kind of the beauty of it, right? 40 plus years as a school administrator in K-12 settings, in roles including both principal, director of special education, everything in between. And Joanne is also the author of the Principal's Special Education Calendar, a gold mine of a guide for you if you are new at leading special ed and want to get a sense of what you need to focus on throughout the school year and when and why it's important and how it works. Joanne is going to be doing a 3-part summer series for us that I will tell you about, specifically around the kinds of topics that we're talking about today. So Joanne, welcome, and we're really looking forward to the series that will focus on that very, very useful book that we are so we're so happy to have and to be familiar with. Rocco Nalli. Rocco, good afternoon. Rocco has over 30 years experience as a special ed administrator and school psychologist, recently retired from Baldwinsville, current SAANYS mentor coach. If you get a mentor coach, you might get Rocco, and he does take special requests around special education. And Rocco is on the NYCASE Board of Directors, so another NYCASE member. Welcome, Rocco. Rocco was also the NYCASE Special Education Administrator of the Year in July of 2023. And we have Raylyn Hellman. Raylyn, welcome. In addition to being the co-vice president of NYCASE, NYCASE, Raylyn is the Director of Special Education and Student Services at Leroy Central School, and Raylyn is also the 2022 SAANYS Educator of the Year. So wowee is all I can say. We are just so glad that we have come together as a group and as a panel, and we really look forward to doing lots more to support you as school leaders. So without further ado, I'm going to just kind of throw out pretty general opening question, and then we're going to let the conversation meander from there, okay? So we're going to start with kind of a little overview, and I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to respond to this question before we kind of go down some other pathways that it will lead to. And last time we met, our panelists and I kind of developed a question, and it started with, I think, a good place for today, and that is, where do we start? That's a really good question with the enormity of the things that face us around special ed. So where do we start? What is one thing, we'd like to hear from each panelist, what is one thing you see as an important topic area or resource for our attendees to grow professionally as a special education leader or a building leader with special education responsibilities? This question is especially meaningful because to our attendees, if you submitted a question, one that came up several times is, where do I start? I'm an assistant principal and I'm working with our special ed staff and teams. What should I prioritize in my learning? What's important for me to know? What's essential for me to know? And how do I get to that? By the way, a lot of that will come to you in resources that we get. So that's the number one question I have for our panel today to get us started. And I'm actually going to kind of call on our panel members to respond to that a little bit. But we can have a self-designated starter. Who'd like to begin? Just you can unmute.
I can
and
begin. I'll
Joyce,
begin.
welcome. All right. Where do we start, Joyce?
Yeah, in the beginning,
Okay.
right? That'd be
Yeah,
that'd be
in
a
the
great
beginning.
place to start.
And please, panelists, add whatever I may have left out in my short introduction.
So we did bat this around a lot about when we took our jobs and our positions and where we are now. What did we wish we knew? What was our kind of our guiding lights as we stepped into our professions? And I always go back to the basic foundations, and I've included in my resources that you'll get later is Part 200 from New York State Education. If that's not on your desktop to check every time somebody asks you a question, I strongly suggest that you get that link on your desktop. Part 200 is what New York State Ed refers to every time you have a question. Now, the trick with Part 200 is the interpretation of the answers. So when you call a regional associate or you call somebody to ask a question, they'll refer you to Part 200. And that's pretty much the only guidance you'll get from State Ed. And then the trick is, how do you interpret that into your question in your district and your practices and policies? But Part 200 is your guidelines to answer all your questions. So whenever you have a question, go to Part 200, see what answer you had. Where in Part 200 you find your answer, and then work through how that applies to your current situation. But Part 200, I strongly suggest as something that you refer to all the time and read all the time. The other piece of advice that I think is really important is really building your team. Building your team, if it's your school psychologist or your social worker, or if you're a principal, if it's your CSE chair, really developing those chains of communication between everyone who touches IEPs. Because it's really important that everybody has an understanding that your door is open, you're going to have questions, and that you're not working in isolation. I worked really hard in my profession to make sure general ed and special ed merged in a lane together. So it wasn't my kid, your kid, our kid, or our problem, your problem, my problem. It was really, let's talk this together, through this together. Let's open up communication together. If principals had questions, they needed to be able to call me and work things out. If they had questions about suspensions or manifestations or superintendent's hearings, it was really important for me to have an understanding of what the situation was in order to give them some guidance. So I think really establishing that open communication with your building support people and vice versa with your district support people is really important for this job, because to make decisions in isolation and not to have all the information, or for the buildings not to have an understanding of why you're making the decision, really breaks down the communication and complicates situations. So they're my two pieces of advice to start this conversation.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And remember, this is being recorded and you will get the recording. So if I were you right now listening, I'd want to be writing everything down because this is so valuable. But remember, you'll get the recording and resources. Who'd like to follow up on that? Lauren, maybe?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Joyce. I think I would piggyback on something that Joyce said. You know, she talked about building this team and really trying to bridge gaps across professionals and building that collaborative team. I think something that historically has been really challenging in terms of being a building leader in this space is that historically, general education and special education have been in these silos. And when we perpetuate these silos and continue to consider general education on kind of on one hand and then special education on the other hand, we're really missing the boat in terms of treating all kids as general education kids first. And also, as if there isn't a responsibility of every single professional in a building to meet the needs of and to understand all kids. And so I think one of the things that I would encourage any building leader to kind of consider is how can we begin to break down these silos between general and special education and encourage through interprofessional collaboration. That's across the gen ed, special ed, classroom teacher lines. That's also across related service into the collaboration with classroom teacher lines. I think teaching teams and modeling how to understand and capitalize on one another's expertise and what is it like to communicate across disciplines is something that many staff members actually really struggle with a little bit, and it's something that we can model and really encourage. How can we build this shared mindset and shared language and shared understanding building wide about how we are building more inclusive schools for all kids. And so, at some point we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like in terms of specific actions. But I think a building leader that really works to break down these silos is going to be much more effective, both in terms of supporting their staff and the students that are in the building.
Lauren, thanks so much. And we'll use this opportunity to talk about resources that folks will get. Can you just share the very useful one that you shared with us that people will receive?
Yes, absolutely.
Tell us what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the resources that I shared is actually like a case conferencing sheet that you can use with an interprofessional team if you are all meeting together as in this interdisciplinary kind of setting to say, okay, we're all working with this one student. What are all of the things that we each know about this student, that we're learning about this student, that we're wondering about this student? And then how can we collaboratively plan intervention supports and ongoing supports that we all need to be aware of and using consistently across this student's day? So you'll find that resource in the follow-up materials. I hope it's helpful.
Thank you. And for our attendees, that point is so important because here's where we are. Lauren started by mentioning, and Joyce mentioned, building a team. We all agree that's really important. We want to do it. The question is, how do we do it? How do we build it? What's the system? What's the process? What's the form we can use to do it? We're all told document, document, document. Okay, how do we do it? What forms do we use? What do we document? It comes down to those kinds of nuts and bolts. So in our resources, you're going to find some of those things that may or may not already exist in your own school and district, in your process. You may be in a school or district that has a very solid process with forms for the kinds of things that you need to do to build teams, to hold meetings, or you may not. So hopefully the kinds of resources that our panelists are sharing will help build that systems process piece, which is so essential to being successful with everything related to special education. So thank you so much for Lauren. Who can follow up? Let's kind of go with Andrew.
I'll jump in. But that's all right. Thanks, Karen. Lauren, I think what you said is spot on. I just want to follow up with a couple of things there. First, which is that you are all instructional leaders, and you're exceptional at that. And the fact that you're here at 4 o'clock on a beautiful Tuesday or Wednesday afternoon, that I forgot what day it is, that, goes to show that we are all here to, support each other with this, whether on the SAANYS side, on the night case side from Pine. So thank you all for that. And Lauren, what you were saying about the collaboration that's necessary, I think also I love to, spend some time exploring what works already. Like, we're doing such great work in certain areas, and some of that extrapolates. So if you're on the gen ed side and that you have things that work for students, I think we can apply that to students who have disabilities as well. So we can think about what works for what students and what their needs are and under what conditions. So before, throwing everything at a problem and trying all the different things in our toolbox, we can try to, think about a particular student, what their needs are, and then, go and try to find. So what are the evidence-based practices that would support what this child needs? And in addition to that, what are the conditions required for this to actually be implemented the way that it needs to be implemented for us to improve the outcome? So I think those are just a couple things I just want to keep in mind, which is just for you to feel good about the work that you're doing as an instructional leader, and to feel empowered and to have really high efficacy around, the instruction of students with disabilities as well. And to know that whether it's a night case or SAANYS or other places, that we're all here to support you with that.
Thank you. Andrew, can you tell us a little bit about the blueprint that is the resource that you shared that folks will receive? What is the blueprint?
Absolutely. So the blueprint for improved results for students with disabilities was published from the New York State Education Department about 10 years ago. And I like this because it is 7 guiding principles supported by research that are just like really good ways to ground us. And you can look at these 7 things and look at, different indicators or treat it like a rubric, but I again like to focus on what we're already doing well and to kind of go look for the bright spots. So if I were going to share this with a team of administrators or with teachers, or just kind of reflect for this myself as an instructional leader, I might look at this and think, wow, what are the things that we are already doing in these ways? How can we celebrate them? How can we study them, learn from them, and really help them to grow? So that's how I choose to look at it. But the first is that we always start with our students. So students with disabilities are engaged in self-advocacy and are involved in really determining their own educational goals and plan. This is at the foundation, that this is student-centered and that they are at the center in determining their own goals. Next, from the student, we take a step back and we say, okay, parents and other family members are engaged as meaningful partners in the education process, in the special education process, everything for the child and in our school. Next, we have teachers who are designing, providing, and assessing the effectiveness of specially designed instruction to provide for students with disabilities with access that they can participate and really make progress in the general education curriculum. In addition, teachers provide research and evidence-based instruction and learning strategies and supports for students. So we started with students, we have parents and families, a step back from that as teachers. And then the last 3 I think about more as like school-wide, district-wide systems pieces, which is that we are all providing multi-tier systems for academic support, behavioral support, that we have high-quality inclusive programs and activities across the board, and that we provide appropriate instruction for students with disabilities in our career development and other opportunities for work-based learning. So again, these are 7 big guiding principles. You can, through the resource that Karen will share, you can see more specific examples of each of these. But my sort of big takeaway from this is that if you're looking at this for the first time, I don't want this to be something seen as like, oh, we're not doing this, or I could improve this. I want you to use this and go out and find the examples where this is already happening, to celebrate those, to find those bright spots, and to share those with others so that we can learn from each other and really spotlight the great things that are happening and that are working to improve outcomes for our students.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And the blueprint is another excellent resource, so useful. How about Rocco?
Okay, great. Well, I would like to piggyback off of what Joyce had initially said also. So Joyce bringing up Part 200 of the New York State Commissioner's Regulations and how important that is. Another
Thank you so much, Rocco. I am looking at the list of questions that are compiled from the questions that registrants sent in. And the one I'm looking at is what are the most critical legal requirements and regulations requiring special education that I should be aware of? And everything that we're hearing here, from Part 200 to the kinds of procedural safeguards and resources that Rocco mentioned and has shared that you'll receive, this is the kind of thing that really is essential. I think all our panelists would agree. These are the essentials in terms of how to suit up and really become very familiar with what you need to know. Let's see, who have we not heard? How about Joanne?
Well, I would add to not only the Part 200, I would add to the Part 201, which kind of backs up to what Rocco was mentioning. I think the understanding of disciplinary processes, timelines, procedures, I think are absolutely critical. Without understanding that and the process of going from that to manifestation determination meetings to superintendent hearings and what's involved, how to stay out of maybe due process complaints, along those lines. I think that's critical. So I think having an understanding of what exactly is in Part 201 is really important. Having that conversation with your assistant principal so that you're on the same page, and also having conversations with your staff. I think one of the other most important things to really consider is, and Lauren touched on this, as I think others have as well, is communication and building relationships. I think when it comes to special education, I think that is just so critical. If you can build relationships with your staff, your gen ed staff, your special ed staff, if you can create that community between them, if you can engage your parents in the processes as well, make sure you have communications with your director of special education, because both of you, your systems are aligned, your services are aligned, you share the same students. you are accountable, as well as your faculty, your staff. Everyone is accountable when it comes to meeting the needs of students with disabilities. So the fact that we all have to be on the same page, have the same mindset, is really critical when it comes to special ed.
Thanks, Joanne. And just kind of mention one of the resources had to do with distinguishing between 504 or IEP.
Right. As a principal, you might have the responsibilities of being the 504 chairperson, for your building. And so what I wanted to provide was just an understanding of the differences between IDA and 504. And so that you really had a clear-cut understanding. And so the resource really outlines in very basic terms, what are the differences, what do the plans look like, what information do you need to have, so that you can, follow through. And it's really just a cursory plan, but at least it sets you off in the right direction. And if you indeed are the 504 representative for your school, then I would strongly suggest, if you do not have that understanding, to please go for training along those lines, and also to make sure that your staff is aware of what exactly constitutes a 504 referral and a referral to CSE, because they're very different.
Thank you. And, as we continue this conversation, I really go back in time when I was a newer leader in a building and faced with different kinds of special education responsibilities with no special ed background. One thing that made it really hard for me was that things weren't really called by names that helped you know what they were, if that makes any sense, right? So a 504, a part 200, 201, that's hard. There's a steep learning curve here. Like, I wish it was called disciplinary procedures in special education for 20, okay, I got what that is. So I really wanted the numbers to have names. And I think that if anything, that makes that learning curve just a little more intimidating for us non-special education types. So really going back to those documents and just getting it clear for yourself. These are some working documents that I need to be familiar with. And here's really what they are. Here's what they're about. Because some of the names, especially when they have numbers, I think are really hard and kind of mysterious. Not to make it, make it a little easier for us at least. So thank you so much, Joanne. How about Raylan?
I think piggybacking on what a lot of us have said is understanding that collaboration is essential. And I would say ask questions. Ask those questions of other administrators, whether within or outside of your district. Find those resources that you can count on. Don't guess in special education. Call the director, because there are so many legal things that it's hard as a director to keep up with all of them. When as a principal or a building leader, you have other things on your plate, reach out and ask those questions. And I think also understanding the Part 200 is important, but understanding an IEP. And if you haven't had a lot of experience with IEPs, going through it with a special education person. So if a parent happens to call you and someone's not available, you can log into the system that you're using. And I know most of us use Frontline, and kind of find those answers if you need them. The Parent Guide to Special Education is also a great resource, which kind of lays out the whole special education process in parent-friendly terms, and I think more and other administrator-friendly terms. The other thing, I know we often in special education talk in acronyms. We have tons of acronyms, and I think ask us to slow down and stop if you're not understanding what we talk about, because we get in our world. And I think sometimes, like, we know what the Part 200 means. We know what a PWN is, which is a prior written notice that has to go to parents before we make any changes to a child's plan or before we evaluate. And so make sure you slow us down and ask those questions, because if you're not understanding, there may be other people in the room as well. And the other thing I'll say is, and I'm going to put my mom hat on for a minute, I am the mom of a young adult with autism, and building relationships with parents is critical as well. But know that sometimes the energy, which could be anger, which could be grief, which could be confusion or fear, is usually not aimed at us. So when you hear for the first time that your child has a disability, or your child comes home and says, this happened in school, and you're saying they didn't follow my IEP. Parents come at us with a level of emotion that sometimes we react to instead of just hearing the words beneath the emotion. And so I tell this to all my teachers, if a parent's really upset, it probably has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
And taking that time to back up and hear what they're saying beneath that level of emotion. And also being okay to say, I hear that you're upset. How can I support you? And just having those people and feeling heard. And I use this example a lot. The first time I said out loud to someone other than my family, my parents, my mom, that, and my husband, that Andrew had autism, I was in a meeting. So I worked in the district, and I was a teacher with a special ed director, the CSE chair, and the CPSE chair. And the director asked me how Andrew was, and I said for the first time he got his diagnosis, and I lost it. I had to leave the meeting, and I was so embarrassed. And I remember sitting in my car having to calm down before I could even drive. And that had nothing to do with the person in the room, but I said out loud for the first time that he had autism. And I think sometimes we get put off by how parents come at us, and just remembering that there's always something behind it that may not have anything to do with us, and how we react could make or break the relationship and cause a due process path versus being able to work through those areas of struggle. And so at the same time, have somebody you can go vent to and talk to about, because they're uncomfortable. They're not pleasant when a parent's yelling at you or crying hysterically. Have someone you can go and talk to about that, but be really mindful of how you respond at those times, because building those trusting relationships, especially of our littles that we might have 20 plus years with this family in the district, is really, really important.
Thank you so much, Raylyn, and thank you for sharing that. I can't not share that I too learned about special education from the other side of the desk in the little chair. My daughter was born with a light form of cerebral palsy that affected speech and learning, and she started getting special services from the time she was 3. And I learned as a parent, when I was still a teacher, long before I was a school leader, what that vulnerability felt like, and that fear, and that sense of I am her advocate first and foremost. And I learned that, and I will tell you that that was more valuable than anything to me as I continued professionally, because once you know what that feels like on the other side of the table in the little chair, you lose any tendency to be flip or quick or not understand that particular kind of vulnerability that parents are feeling. So I think we can't say enough, in addition to the regulations and things that we need to know so much about, that human piece, understand what it feels like on the other side of that table, is absolutely essential. And we're also going to talk a lot more about building the team, because we keep hearing that from all of our panelists. And I would say too that as a school leader, it was my counselors, my school counselors are often underutilized by school leaders. They are so valuable to have in meetings, to learn from, and my school psychologist, who literally schooled me when I did have to learn more about the leadership part of it much later on. I could turn to her, and I could turn to other special ed teachers in my building. You've got to reach out to those folks who know, and you have to find kind of your own team that you're really comfortable with reaching out to in a very candid way. It's so important and so supportive. So thank you so much. I'd like to now go to Brett for a minute, because Brett kind of, you've been listening to all kinds of things floating around and resources, and just kind of share with us from your seat, which is a different seat, what you see as kind of most essential for folks to really be aware of and prioritize.
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Karen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I apologize.
That's okay.
connection there.
We're good.
Great. Yeah, so it's funny, Karen, you hit the nail on the head with a couple of my themes, which was processes and documentation. And of course, what does that mean, right? So in my experience here at SAANYS as counsel, oftentimes we or I am being brought in after the fact, right? When maybe an audit has occurred, maybe there's an investigation into the department or one of our administrators with how they are executing their duties. And through my time dealing with those cases and kind of taking the temperature across the state of where at least district council and special education council are moving towards, it's really leaning towards conducting audits of our departments, of our special education departments. And to get out ahead of that, or if you're already involved in an audit, one thing that I would recommend to our administrators, whether you are new to the school district, whether you're new to a role touching on special ed, or if you've been in that position and district for a long time, I think you should spend time reviewing your processes, right? And that's a bit of a global recommendation, but that's exactly how you should look at it. Everything from how do we document calls that come in from parents, email inquiries, requests for evaluations, requests for independent educational evaluations. How do we document what our timelines are for getting to CSE? Are we calendaring those dates appropriately, both in our administrators' calendars as well as our teachers' calendars and our providers? And from there, I think you'll learn a lot about what you may already be doing well, as Andrew touched on, and maybe some areas that can improve. And I think from a legal perspective, right, I look at this oftentimes. I know that the great work you all are doing. We see it day in and day out. We hear it. And at the same time, I want to make sure you're managing risk, right? And that's what a lot of times with our process evaluation and our documentation, what we can do is manage that risk both from a relationship with the family and the student and ensuring that they are getting that free access to public education, but also managing that risk in your own role and functioning both maybe in a probationary capacity or in a tenured capacity, right? I just finished up a 3020A trial that ran 27 days, the bulk of which focused on the special education department. And I will note that almost none of the charges or facts that we dealt with had to do whether or not students were appropriately receiving a free access to a public education, but more so dealt with the processes, the documentation. And I think that is a great start for all of us, right? Especially maybe heading into the end of the year and over the summer, is to take some time and reevaluate. How is it that we communicate with parents? Are we consistently printing those communications off? Do we have phone logs? How often are we training and meeting with our staff to ensure that IEPs are being drafted appropriately with present levels of performance and inclusive of all necessary and up-to-date evaluations, and then conducting those trainings and reiterating these processes and how to go about documenting those different items that Part 200 and 201 might require. But a lot of times where we are litigating is in the gray. It's best practices, right? And that documentation and consistent reevaluation of processes will always work in your favor. And I'm, I'd be happy to speak on that more, obviously, as we go through this series, because I do think there are particular issues that you could spend time reevaluating. And that reevaluation and growth will always look positive on our membership when they are being evaluated.
Thanks, Brett. And once again, Brett, you brought up the importance of systems, process, and like we said, some districts may have more or less of that in place, but forming a team and working toward getting more of that in place in a way that really is productive for all of your members of your special ed community is a really valuable thing to do. That kind of, you want to cut down the confusion, the chaos by that real focus on systems and process that may or may not be in abundance in your district. So thank you. I want to go ahead.
One comment, and
yes,
I led with that oftentimes we're involved after the fact, right? But I hope
yes,
membership really understands that we are absolutely only a phone call away.
yes.
If you're in the thick of it, if you have a question, call us at that point. We have fantastic resources just on this call alone. But please don't think that you can only contact us after the fact, because we
Yes.
are and look forward to working through that with you, well before there's ever an issue that you're dealing with. Thanks.
Absolutely. So when in doubt, pick up that phone, call SAANYS, and it does not have to be something that you think isn't as big a deal as it needs to be. We can really help with questions that you have. So thanks for reminding us of that, Brett. I want to answer a couple of questions that are coming up, and I see the same question has come up in the chat that came up on the questions that were submitted. So let's kind of take a look at it, and that has to do with an increase in students who are English language learners who also have an IEP. That's come up several times in all of the questions that we have received. So whoever on our panel might want to kind of comment on that a little bit.
I think this is a complex area of need for understanding. And so I think using the partnership centers to support and have training in this area, as well as our ARBRNs in the state, to understand the Part 154, which is the ENL regulations, and how the Part 200 and the 154 work together. It's very difficult to tease out sometimes whether it's disability or language acquisition. So I think that's really important that we have conversations about that, and our ARBRN is super helpful there. But being creative in providing the support. So there have been an increase. I think bilingual evaluations are they're hard to find in some places in the state. Like if you're in rural areas, it's very hard to find bilingual school psychologists. But if you can, that information is really helpful when trying to decide whether or not a child qualifies or not. But then when services are provided, we've been creative in how to do that. So having special education teachers and ENL teachers possibly work together during a resource room or a special class, so that push-in time can be a part of the special ed support time as well. And really teasing out individual needs of each student as we're planning for those options. So for kiddos with complex disabilities that also need ENL support, it's really hard to find time for OT, PT, speech, their special ed support and ENL support. So it's working as a team. And again, that's another person that you want to have access to, is who's at your ARBRN and who can answer those questions, so that when you're planning the support for kids, that it's seamless, because we want to make sure we're approaching it in similar ways, so that the kids don't feel fragmented across their day when they're getting all of those different services. And I will say, as a special educator, that wasn't my area of expertise, but I've had to deal with it more. And really, the non-district specialists or our bilingual specialists at our partnership centers, as well as our ARBRNs, are great places to ask those questions.
Thank you, Raylyn. Anybody else want to add anything to that question around ELLs, dual certificate?
Well, I think Yeah, I think the relationships between, again, this is another piece where relationships are important because you want to look at and see if your ENL teacher can team teach with your gen ed teacher, and they're fine about having the content areas be taught maybe by the gen ed teacher, and then you come in as the ENL teacher and you look at the comprehension and the vocabulary piece. If that's a possibility, are your ENL services, are they also being provided as a separate service in another room? Or are you able to tag team with anyone else? There are some cases where ENL services are looked at and provided as portion of maybe a student's English course. That might be, a possibility and something that's looked into. But again, is it also going to be a separate pullout so that the student is in their content area and pulled out separately for ENL supports? It can be complicated, especially at, the secondary level when you're looking at, student schedules.
Thank you. Is there anyone listening, any of our attendees who would like to unmute and either ask a follow-up question around that same topic or add a comment? Also, I would invite our attendees to please put questions up in the chat. And we will try to get to the questions that come up there before we close for today. So feel free to do that. Okay, so thinking about kind of helpful strategies. So we just heard also about part 154. And, I'm really thinking for some of you, maybe you're a newer leader, an assistant principal, you're just kind of getting your experience started around special education and dealing with your special education communities. I would say, really think about make an old-fashioned binder. I mean, okay, it can be electronic, but, part 154 and label what it is. 200, what is it? 201, what is it? What's a 504? Putting those kinds of things in some kind of easily accessible resource where it's all in one place is very helpful, because it takes a while to understand that the answers are somewhere, right? The answers really are somewhere. They exist. They're in all different fragmented pieces, perhaps, in some of these documents that we're talking about, but the answers exist. And knowing how to kind of get to them and get the information you need when you need it is really, really helpful. Anything else that our panelists want to comment on, just in terms of that way to get much more familiar and much more acquainted with the learning curve?
Karen, the other resource I added was a memo from SpEd that gives the New York State IEP template and the PDA and all the other requirements that need to be sent out with the CSE notice. So there's the notice of meeting, there's the prior written notice, there's the board approval letter template. So I put that link in just so you have an idea of all the paperwork that's associated with the CSE meeting. And if you're a not special ed background person who's in charge of CSE, it's really important to understand those documents and when they have to go out. And they're not very clear. SpEd is not very clear about when it has to be sent out, especially prior written notices. There's cases when they have to go out, such as manifestation determinations, or after a CSE meeting, or when any decision is being made. From a CSE perspective, like whether you're doing an IEE, an independent evaluation or not, what's the reasoning? So there's a lot of circumstances when those templates have to be used that are confusing. So I think it's really important to review those and look at those documents to make sure you understand what has to be in each field of each of those documents. And I've been involved in a few legal proceedings now, and they're really getting in depth about picking apart those documents. And do you have the right information in there? Did you put what was discussed, what was refused, what was accepted, what was your reasoning? Because SpEd was really good and gave us boilerplate language for those documents, but that does not fly when you're sitting in a due process or you're sitting in a 3020A and trying to justify your decisions and what you did. So really important to look at those documents, understand when you need to use them and what has to go in there. And that's something that I think we're going to have to discuss more and offer that kind of support, because it's confusing and it's really getting some people in hot water.
Thank you.
And I
Thank you.
think to piggyback off of that, it's also to have an understanding that IDA and your Part 200 and Part 201, because your 200 and 201 can exceed what's in IDA, and others may not realize that. They may look at one versus the other and not understand that there are some differences there. So I think that's important.
Thank you. Let's talk for a minute about IEPs, because I know that one thing that came up in our panelist conversations and came up in our questions as well is the issue around access to IEPs. So maybe some of our panelists can kind of comment around good things to know or prioritize around that question of access to IEPs, familiarity.
So I can just really quickly jump in, because I learned the hard way when you talk about procedures and having good procedures in place when I started off young, well, not young, but when I started off as an administrator in special education, where that it's a critical regulation that all the individuals, the team that has some responsibility of the implementation of that IEP needs to not only have access to that IEP, but to have read it and to have been able to ask questions about that IEP prior to its implementation. So that is something you just don't want to get yourself caught up in, where you come to a manifestation determination meeting and someone at that team states, "Oh, I didn't know, that I was supposed to do that, or that was in the kid's IEP," because that's an immediately a connection that's found because the IEP wasn't implemented by that, and then that kid, no further disciplinary action can take place for a kid in that situation. But you also don't want it to happen where something bad happens, or an incident happens in school, a kid maybe gets injured or something, and it's related to something that was in an IEP that a person that was supposed to implement that IEP didn't do or didn't know about. So really, I included as one of the resources that you'll receive is a IEP sign-off form. I think it's important to have a really strong procedure in place for your district, so that everyone, there's no excuses. Everyone has access to that IEP prior to its implementation, prior to the first day of school, and that they in fact have read those IEPs. So they all the kids that they are responsible for, they read their IEPs, have had an opportunity to ask questions about those IEPs from the case manager, and then sign off on it, sign and date it, and that you keep that documentation, so that you are, you're sort of like putting the onus on the teachers. It's their responsibility, but you're also having your documentation in place in the event that someone questions that.
Thank you. I want to just kind of follow up with another question around that. And that is, when I was a brand new assistant principal, one of the duties that I had was to work closely with the bus drivers around issues related to bus behavior. That was fun. And one thing that came up very, very frequently, this was a big issue, and it was a gray area. Somehow we expected that bus drivers would know which kids had disabilities and could be expected perhaps to behave in certain ways, and to know how to address that. And none of that was true or accurate. So a big question would always come up around bus behavior. And how am I supposed to know with regard to students with disabilities? And how am I supposed to know how to address those behaviors, interact with that student? That was a very real big deal. And I would like it if, maybe some of our panelists can kind of comment on that, because it may be something that some of our attendees are dealing with.
Yeah,
Who's on the team who gets to know about the IEP? Who's the team? Is it the custodian, the lunch lady? Who is it?
Yeah. I mean, what I can say quickly is, I think one of the things that's really broken about many of our systems is that we only train the quote unquote special ed folks on how to
Yes.
understand and support our special ed kids. Right.
Yes.
And then we're perpetuating this idea that like, well, that's not my kid, and I don't know how to deal with that kid. And well, if I'm not a specialist, I don't know how to support that autistic child. And what I know we've seen a lot with the schools that we work with is when you train and support every single professional in a school building, including the custodial staff, including the bus drivers, including the folks that are in the front office, so that everyone has a deeper understanding of students who may present a little bit differently. It's no longer quite as critical to memorize every student's IEP, which isn't going to be something that is realistic. But if everyone has an understanding of kids who may socialize differently, communicate differently, right? Move through space a little bit differently, you're a little bit more equipped and have a little bit more patience and understanding of how to create a warm and welcoming, safe space for all kids.
Thank you. And I'll just take a look at the question that came up in the chat. What are the confidentiality laws regarding non-certified staff, teaching assistants, bus drivers, lunch aides, who work with students with disabilities and have signed off on the documentation? How do we ensure that the information isn't shared, et cetera?
You should be training all those staff. So bus driver training over the summer from the CSE office. There's PJ's Law. There's stuff that the bus drivers need to be trained in. We did confidentiality at that time. You should be in really close contact with your director of transportation all the time. I met with them regularly. I went over IEPs with them. I went over because if you look on the IEP, there is that transportation piece at the end. Who needs specialized transportation? What do they need it for? If there's a behavioral issue, is that a behavioral plan that carries over on the bus? If so, they should have hard copies of that behavioral plan. You should be meeting with the bus aide if they have to have one-to-one support on a bus. So again, it's that implementation of that IEP document and making sure anybody that has to implement it understands their roles, their responsibilities, and what behaviors or characteristics they may come in contact with, which Lauren says, if you train everybody, at least everybody has that base knowledge, and then you can become more specific. But we also did training for paraprofessionals. If they're responsible for students, they should be going through training about what's on the IEP, what's the characteristics of the student, and what is their responsibilities to react to students and follow a behavioral plan. So yes, there's confidentiality, but there's also, you should train those people about what their responsibilities are and what confidentiality is. So we talked often about, you don't discuss in the line at Wegmans what the behavior on the bus was today, because the person checking you out may be that student's aunt. So you really have to have that kind of conversation about, you don't talk about other students outside of school. You don't talk to, you don't even tell parents necessarily all the information. You work through your case manager. You have a line of communication when incidents happen, but it's just a matter of training. And again, documenting who you trained, what you trained them in, have them signed off that they've been trained, do attendance, just so you can say that you've trained your paraprofessionals, your bus aides, your hall monitors, all of those.
And I think
Right. And Joyce, when you say so much is coming back to that critical word, communication. So maybe something we can dive into deeper, down the road, is improving communication, taking down some of the silos and becoming more knowledgeable about what appropriate communication is and how we articulate that. That's another
And
key
how
word.
you document it.
And how you document it.
But there's also an understanding that those IEPs are fluid.
Yes.
And so what you discuss necessarily over the summer during superintendent conference day may not be the same come November. All right. So I think there's also needs to be an understanding that these documents change over time, and we need to keep up with that process as well.
Thank you. I think someone was going to start to speak. It could be an attendee.
Yeah, Karen, that's
Yeah.
me, Brett. Yep. Maybe Joanne or Joyce or anyone else could speak to this, but I know this comes up, and a clear question: who gets access to that full IEP? Is it teachers? Is it providers? Does it include teaching aides? Or does it include the director of transportation? Or is there a line, and outside of that line you might not be getting access to the full IEP, but you might be getting something else, right? So where is that line? And I know that, Joyce, that's come up with us even in a past matter with complaints of TAs claiming to never have had access to the full IEP, and there's some differences of opinion there. Maybe you guys could speak to that. And I apologize, Karen, that I'm but that's an important question, I think.
Certainly is.
My understanding has always been who has a right to know. In terms of, the full review of the IEP, in terms of portions of the IEP, are you going to sit down and review the entire IEP necessarily with your TAs, with your aides, depending upon what their responsibilities are? I think it just becomes a matter of you looking at the individual students and saying who actually needs to have this information in its entirety, or who needs to have just a piece of the information.
Yeah, and I appreciate that answer, because I think this is another one of those areas that, as Joyce and you all have mentioned, we have the regs, but interpretation is key, and what is best practice, right? And that's where I continue to fall back to, if that is the practice that you're pursuing, though, that only those who sit on the CSE and are going to be implementing different provisions of the IEP get access and full review. Document what your procedure is. Have a procedure that, okay, and also because it really does touch on FERPA, right? And that's where we are seeing, there's two sides to the coin, that we all want everyone to be in the loop, but until you've included too many people in the loop. So I think that is very important. But if you have a process outlined, for TAs, it'll be upon the teacher who that TA serves with, for them to go ahead and review the important sections, right? And just actually delineating those responsibilities, I think ensures that the right people do get access to what they need to, but also covers that you have that process in place. And if you need to adjust it, you can adjust it.
Thank you. And while we're talking about roles and access, a question did come up in the chat that maybe we can just respond to quickly. Can an aide provide accommodations for a special education student?
Yes, I believe so. I just believe that you have to have trained that aide. So a lot of paraprofessionals are the scribes for students, but you need to train them what that means. Or if they're going to be the person that reads the test to the student, what does that look like? What's that? How do you model that? So there is a testing accommodation guide from New York State Education Department that tells you about different tests and about different accommodations and how to disseminate them. But it really goes to the training piece, that you've documented, that you've trained these aides, who has trained them, how often are they trained. You can't just send a paraprofessional out of the room and let them do anything that they believe is appropriate for an accommodations, because some of them really want kids to do really well and do things that probably would fall out of the guidelines of what the appropriate accommodation is. And again, on the IEP, it says criteria for accommodations. What's the specification of the accommodation? So that person needs to understand what their role is in providing that.
Not only training your current subs, but also your subs that are on your sub list, who you might be calling at any given time.
And that does relate to a question that we received, was around coverage issues, which is so challenging right now with getting subs into mandated positions when we're unable to fill classroom positions. So, a lot of this kind of ties together. We are getting close to our time to wrap up. If any one of our attendees has a question that you would really like to ask, please unmute right now and do so. If not, we'll continue for a couple of minutes.
Hi, I put a note in the chat about the laws for physical education teachers providing adaptive services in physical education.
Okay.
Being part of CSEA teams and knowing the students' IEPs and participating in writing them. What have you seen across the state with regard to this level of participation?
I did read that question. I didn't see the piece where you said that that's an adaptive PE, so that changed my thought process from what I was thinking would be the answer. So if it's the
We do not
adaptive,
offer adaptive physical education in my very large district, so that's why I'm asking.
okay, so you're asking are PE teachers being on the CSE teams and knowing students' IEPs and 504 plans. Well, PE teachers are part of the team that has to deliver the services, so they have to have access to the documents, to the IEPs and the 504 plans. And about participating in a CSE meeting, I would reflect back to, is there a trait of the disability or a characteristic of the disability that interferes either with the gross motor or fine motor, where there will be goals around PE, or that there are accommodations that, you know, are pretty lengthy, that the PE teacher should have that input about how they're functioning in their classroom and what accommodations are appropriate. So I would say not every student's PE teacher comes to CSE meetings, but if there is some physical element to that student that it should be discussed about what accommodations they need, or is there a goal there, or is there a physical therapist involved? If there's something to that, then maybe the PT is working with the PE teacher. So it really would depend on what the student's individual needs are, whether or not I would invite the PE teacher to be on the team. But they certainly have access to the IEP if that student's in their classroom.
Do you
And so
see any
are you,
problems with 611 or 811 being pushed in to a regular ed class?
so I'm going to jump on. So are you asking, should you be offering adaptive phys ed?
I'm told no, but I'm
Right.
worried
So I
about
would
my
say,
teachers and
right.
and the students in a 611 or an 811 being merged in with an entirely too large class already of physical
So
education.
there are a couple of things there. So I would say your director of special ed should have a process for evaluating whether or not a child needs adaptive phys ed, because you can't just say as a district that we don't offer a special education service that a child might need. So that's one piece. What is the process? And I think it's an individual child basis, just like everything else. If they need phys ed, or if they need adaptive phys ed and physical therapy, that may be a kiddo that you're looking at that. Do they have behavioral needs that would impact them being pushed into a gen ed phys ed class with 40 other kids? Is it a child with sensory needs that has the gym itself is a challenge? So those decisions need to be made on an individual child basis. And to just say we don't offer that could get you in some trouble as a district. So I think you need to have a process for how do you assess the need, and then conversations about if kids are struggling in those settings, what are the accommodations that they might need to be successful if they're pushing into a gen ed phys ed classroom. So there's a lot of layers to that question. And if we do have adaptive phys ed, our teachers do participate in helping to develop that IEP and development of goals, usually in combination with physical or occupational therapy as well.
Thank you. Once again, there are questions that we did not get close to addressing during this short hour, but we will be back. And I would like to, in the couple of minutes we have left, just kind of tell you about a couple of things that are coming up. One of them is our conference in October, October 26th and 27th. It's at the beautiful Sagamore Resort this year in Bolton Landing. And we hope to feature our panel and our panelists around this kind of topic and give you more of an opportunity to ask some questions. I'd also like to tell you, and Michelle, if you could just kind of share on the screen the two flyers that we have. One is a SAANYS Pro Learning event, that's SAANYS Professional Learning, which is what we are engaging in today. And this is a three-part series that I mentioned that Joanne will be facilitating this summer in July around the book, The Principal Special Education Calendar. You can see a flyer with a complete description, and registration will be open. I'm going to say early next week. The flyer is just about done. It will be up on our website, and registration will be available for that. Because SAANYS has gotten a significant grant recently, that's why we are able to offer some of these kinds of events free of charge to both members and non-members. And for this event, the book itself will be provided, but you must register and actually attend the series in order to get the book at the conclusion of the series. So sometimes we sign up for things that are free and we don't, something changes and we can't attend. If you register and attend, you'll also get a copy of the book. So that's something you can look at more closely on the website. And Lauren, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the Pine Program event that's coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We have a virtual conference coming up next week. It's on the 7th and 8th. We're offering a 50% discount, although it's a pretty low cost event already. We really want to encourage school leaders and other staff members to attend. It's a virtual conference that features a number of neurodivergent special education advocates. We're going to really focus on concrete strategies and practices to build more inclusive schools for our neurodiverse communities. We also have a free parent and community session that is offered. So we'd love to see folks from SAANYS participating. Again, you'll get in the follow-up materials a special discount code, so please utilize that. You can either join live or, because I know what schedules are like, you can register to get access to any of the recordings. So hopefully folks will take advantage, and we'll see you next week.
That's great. Thank you so much. I really can't thank our panelists enough for not only being here today, but for the preparation that went into today. And I think as we prepared, we really came together as a team. The A-team, the Super Friends are right here. And we're going to ask those Super Friends to activate more, down the road by doing different things that can support you. And I really think, let's circle back to what Andrew mentioned really early, and that is, you know what, we really have to, special ed, I'm just going to say it, special ed can get so bogged down in the stuff, in the acronyms and the documents and the numbers and the documentation and the stress and the meetings and the agita of it all, that I think, our school communities and ourselves, we can forget what this is all about, like why we got married in the first place kind of thing. And that is, it's really about those students. It's always about that in terms of what we can do to be the best we can be, to do the best we can for the real kids and the real families who go with those kids. And so sometimes just kind of herding your folks back to that essential question and meaning, what I call the why did we get married to begin with question, is really essential, because otherwise you really can get bogged down and lost in the weeds that are so essential to know and understand, but are not really at the final hour what it's all about anyway, right? So I hope we've kind of conveyed that to you, and I hope we can do more talking about that, as well as all the really, really good information and expertise that was shared here today. So I hope you're open to coming to some other things, the summer series, the conference, and we're going to do more. So I hope you enjoyed being here today. And once again, thank you so much to our panel. And thank you, Michelle, for helping us get this up and running today. We hope you benefited and enjoyed it, and it's still a beautiful day out there. So everyone have a lovely, lovely evening, and we hope you come back for more because there's much more to do. Thank you. Have a